Hello everyone, welcome to our PMP exam questions and answer solving session for February. Now, if you are preparing for the PMP exam, you can use today's class to assess how well you are prepared for the exam, okay? So out of the 5 questions that we are going to solve today, the target will be to get all the 5 out of the 5 questions correct. However, the minimum expectation is that you should get at least 4 out of the 5 questions correct to consider yourself fairly well prepared for the PMP exam. Now, anything less than that, you might need a bit more preparation, okay? Also, if you are preparing for the PMP exam, you might want to check out my training courses on Udemy, and you can also consider to join my YouTube membership community. All of them are very well reviewed amongst the students like you, and I will provide all the details on how you can join the same later on in this video, okay? So give this video a like, get a pen and a paper, and let's get started with question number 1.
Right, so question number 1, guys, please read the question and try to answer it before we solve this together. You can pause the video here if you wish to. Right, so let's get started. A project has the following characteristics, okay? To identify the best approach for construction, a site assessment was conducted. Next, a change request was approved, okay? The word of the question here is approved, okay? To shift the project location, which of course contradicts the findings of the original site assessment. So what happened was there was a change request which was approved, okay, which let's say mandated the shift of the project location from, let's say, X to Y. However, initially when the project charter was signed off, it had location X, and now there is a new location Y, which is of course followed through a proper change request, and it has been approved. Okay, so it is very important thing to consider as part of this question. And finally, risk and data analysis was conducted before the change request was approved. Okay, so the question is, which action should the project manager take? Option A, proceed with the change request, reject the change request, request a detailed report of the risk analysis, request a new site assessment for the proposed location. Now, mind here, guys, that whenever you are project manager and when there is a change request which has been approved, and when I mean approved, it is approved by your project sponsor. We can take it for a valid assumption. Okay, it has been approved by PMO. It has gone through a proper change management process. So as a project manager, whatever you personally think in terms of the change of this location doesn't matter, because since the change request is now approved, you should proceed with the change request in terms of the implementation. So the correct answer to this question is option A. Of course, you cannot reject the change request. That is totally outright, let's say, felony in terms of general project management. Let's say option C, request a detailed report of the risk analysis. You can do that, but that doesn't change anything because the change request has already been approved, guys. Okay, if it is approved, you have to ensure that it has followed through the right procedures, right approval channels, right escalation matrices, etc., etc. And that is why option C is also incorrect. Let's look at option D, which is to request a new site assessment for the proposed location. Again, a pointless exercise. You can do some intellectualization in terms of understanding why this location changed from X to Y, but again, it is for your own knowledge, but that doesn't change the situation that the change request has been approved. It is now part of your project scope. Your scope baseline is updated, and you need to start executing the project in terms of this approved change request specifications that has come your way. Okay, so the correct answer to this question is option A.
Now, if you are preparing for your PMP exam, guys, I would suggest that you check out my PMP exam preparation courses on Udemy. All the courses are very highly rated amongst the students, and many PMP aspirants like you have passed their PMP exam with the help of these courses. You can check the student reviews on Udemy, and all the links will be provided in the description section of this video in case you are interested to join. Okay, and now let's move on to question number 2.
Right, so question number 2, guys, please read the question and try to answer it before we solve this together. So the drill will remain the same. You can pause the video here if you wish to. Okay, so let's get started. A project team working on a new software implementation reports delays in completing critical tasks. Okay. The project manager identifies that the root cause is the team's limited experience, or let's say skill set, with the new software platform. In which 3 ways can the project manager prevent this situation in future projects. So you have to choose like 3 options from the 5 options that are provided in the question. Now these kind of questions are called multi-select questions, and you will find such questions in your PMP exam. And these kind of questions basically state how many options you need to select as part of your multiple selection. Okay, so for example, this question is mentioning that you need to select 3 correct answer choices from the list of 5. So what's happening here is the project team is working on a new software implementation project, and of course it's reporting some delays and some problems with completing the critical tasks. Okay. Now the project manager, which is, let's say you have done a root cause analysis and you have found out that the limited experience of the team, or let's say your team is having a very limited skill set with the new software platform which is being used for the project, and that is why it is causing such kind of issues in the project. Okay. Now, what are the 3 options you can select here to prevent this kind of situation? And this is very important part of the question, guys, that you have to select the options which will help you to plan some systemic fixes for future projects. Okay, it is very important to note here that the question is not asking that what you should do in this project now to salvage the situation, right? It is asking that what kind of systemic fixes you need to take so that, of course, these kind of things might be sorted right in the planning phase, and you need not sort of do these kind of damage control measures in the execution stage. But the crux here is to identify the options which will help you to plan some systemic fixes for future projects. Okay, so let's look at option 1, which is to ask the subject matter experts to implement a solution. This is incorrect, guys. Okay, because if you're going to subject matter experts to implement a solution, okay, you are taking an action for this project, and it is not something which will not guarantee that in the next project again you will not be calling upon the subject matter experts to implement the solution. Okay, otherwise what is your role as a project manager, right? Because every time you face a problem, you go to subject matter experts and ask for resolution. Okay, so that is why this is not a systemic fix, and that is why option A is incorrect. Let's look at option B. Prepare a project skill matrix and organize the team accordingly. So basically what a skill matrix is it has the names of your team members on the y-axis, and on the x-axis it has the required skills. Okay, and you have a plot of your team members, and you identify that for, let's say, team member A, B, or C, what are the various skills which are listed along the x-axis is needed to be successful in the project. That is basically a skill matrix. So this is a good kind of tool to prepare at the very beginning stages of the project, maybe in the planning stages, to identify what are the skills that are necessary for a project to be successful, and whether your team members have those required skill set or not. So B is definitely a correct answer choice. Let's look at option C, which is to prepare a repository of the critical skills needed for the project. This is basically what you have in the x-axis of a skill matrix, right? Which is a repository of the critical skills needed for a project. So for example, you might say that, okay, I need a developer, I need a coder, I need a, let's say, a tester, I need sort of a cybersecurity professional, etc., etc. Okay, so those are the skills. Now, one person can have multiple skill sets. Okay, however, you need to have a repository of the critical skills that will be necessary for a project to be successful. So again, option C is a correct answer choice. Let's look at option D. Outsource the tasks to a skilled consultant. Okay, now this can be a correct answer choice. Okay, now some of you might argue that, okay, Ray, you are outsourcing tasks to a skill consultant, then are you valuing your current team who is doing the project at the moment, right? Fair point. Let's hold this option for now, and we'll come back to it in a second. Let's look at option E. Update the risk register with skill deficiency as a project risk. Now you tell me, guys, as a project manager, if you are just updating the risk register and you are saying that, okay, I have a skill which is deficient, and that is a project risk. It has like a high, medium, low impact, high, medium, low probability, etc., etc. And I'm updating the risk register of the project. Does it sort of foolproof you with your aspirations in terms of how you would like a good project to run in future, right? It's not. So that is the reason option E is incorrect, because probably you can update the risk register in this project. You can have some mitigation actions. You can say that, okay, I have a skill deficiency, etc., etc. but that doesn't give me the confidence that it is a systemic fix which you are putting in place for your future projects. And that is why option E is definitely incorrect. Now that leaves us option D as the correct answer choice, because of course you needed to select like three answer choices, right? However, in terms of logical reasoning as well, D makes sense, because if you do not have a skill set within your team, sometimes it becomes quite expensive to develop that skill set. Okay, now for example, let's say you do not have the skill set of coding in your team. Now if you say that, okay, I will start teaching coding to my team members, and once they learn coding, they can apply that coding to develop a product, then your project will take ages, right? So that is sometimes not a very prudent move as a project manager. You can't like sort of build everything from scratch. Sometimes you need to outsource stuff to people who are more skilled or more experienced in doing these kind of work. Another example could be accountancy or legal, right? So you need to have accountancy or legal representations within your project sometimes. Now will you say that, okay, I will start coaching one of my team members to become an accountant or to become a lawyer? Okay, that is quite absurd, right? So that is an example that sometimes it makes perfect sense to outsource a task to a skilled consultant, if that makes sense for the project financially as well. Okay, so that is why option D is also a correct answer choice. So the correct answer to this question is option B, option C, and option D. And that gives you three answer choices, which let's say the project manager can take as a systemic fix to avoid such kind of situation in future projects. Okay, this is very, very important.
Now, before we move on to question number 3, guys, I would suggest that you check out my membership community on YouTube as part of your PMP exam preparation. I share daily posts on PMP exam tips, tricks, and strategies via this platform. It's a monthly subscription based service, okay, and you can cancel anytime you want to. All the links will be provided in the description section of this video, so please do check it out. Okay, and now let's move on to question number 3.
Right, so question number 3, guys, the drill will remain the same. Please read the question and try to answer it before we solve this together. You can pause the video here if you want to. Right, so let's get started. The burn down chart shows some story points as incomplete. Okay, now for that you need to understand what is a burn down chart, right? So please go back and study your agile practice guide, or you can watch the videos on my YouTube channel as well, where I have discussed these topics of burn up and burn down charts. Please go back and study the previous month's Q&A sessions. Okay, so basically burn down charts are an agile tool which gives you sort of a progress report in terms of the way you are progressing through a agile sprint or a agile iteration. Okay, it has a number of story points, and as you complete the story points, your chart actually burns down in terms of the story points that are remaining to be completed. It is basically a let's say a schedule tracking tool, in where your scope is your story points and your schedule is how many story points is left to complete. Okay, so that is basically a burn down chart. Okay, so here the burn down chart is showing that some story points are incomplete. Now this becomes apparent at the end of a sprint cycle. Now the sprint cycle has ended, and of course it has been found that the story points which were supposed to be completed in that sprint, it is not completed, or they are not completed. Let's say if there are multiple story points, and it is something of concern to the project manager. So multiple team members worked on the story points and no impediments were identified. So this is the funny bit, that there were a lot of team members who were working on those story points, and they have not reported any kind of concerns or risk, etc., with respect to the execution or the completion of those story points. Okay, so how should the agile team tackle the situation? Okay, so that is the question. So let's look at the options one by one. Option A, which is to revisit the product backlog and add the story points in, then wait for a less intensive sprint to complete the same. Okay, now this is incorrect, guys. Okay, because if you wait for a less intensive sprint to take in these story points, what is the guarantee that these story points are not as intensive as the story points that you will be picking up in your future sprint, right? So there is no guarantee of that. Secondly, what makes you believe, or what is that data point that we have in this question which gives us confidence that it is okay to wait on these story points for the next sprint next suitable sprint, let's say, to come up, right? So there is no sort of those kind of assumptions that we can take. These story points might be very important in terms of the foundational elements of a project that you are executing, right? So that is why it is sort of not okay to consider adding those story points in a later sprint, which you think might be less intensive, which can definitely not be the case when it comes to reality, right? So that is why option A is incorrect. Let's look at option B. Organize a spike to understand the complexity of the story points. Again, this is incorrect again, right? Because if the story points were complex, there would have been impediments or blockers that would have been called out in your stand-ups or in your daily sprint review meetings, right? And generally you do spike on a story point which is typically very complex, and typically you are not able to break the story point down into manageable chunks or manageable pieces, and that is why you organize a spike, which is sort of a brainstorming session to break down a complex story point into simple multiple story points. Okay, so this is also incorrect here, because as of now it has been mentioned in the question stem that there were no impediments or blockers or risks that were highlighted whilst the story points were not worked upon. Okay, so that is why option B is also incorrect. Let's look at option C. Proceed with the next sprint and document the incomplete story points in the sprint retrospective. Again, that is totally outrageous, guys, because sprint retrospective is not about documenting that, okay, we were not able to complete the scope. Okay, it is actually documenting that, okay, what were the learnings coming out of a sprint or iteration, etc., etc. Okay, so, and you can't just leave these story points out for the next sprint and start documenting that, okay, it is fine, we were not able to complete these story points, but that's okay, let's document it as a retrospective. That is not taken, right? Because as a project manager, you are expected that you will be completing the entire scope of the project or the sprint or the iteration that we are talking about. So that is why option C is also incorrect, and that leaves us with option D, which is the correct answer choice to this question, which is to break down the story points into smaller story points, okay, each with its definition of ready. And that makes perfect sense, because that might have been the case that this story point was, let's say, maybe simple. Okay, it was not very complex, but since it was such of a large scope that needed to be considered, because let's say story points are similar to WBS, right? Work breakdown structure. So if you have a very big work package, which is part of your work breakdown structure, ideally it needs broken down into sort of sub work packages, right? Similar with story point. So if you define a story point which looks simple, but it is like quite complex in terms of uh, execution as a single overall story point, you generally break it down into smaller story points. That doesn't need a spike to do that, but at least you need like something called as a decomposition, where you break down a WBS or you break down a work package into your smaller WBSs, similar with the story points. And that might be one of the reason that nobody sort of highlighted it, because the story point looked simple in terms of execution, but the entire scope of it, okay, was quite huge to be executed in a single sprint. That might be the reason that no impediment or risks were highlighted. Okay, so breaking it down into smaller story points might make sense, and that is why option D is the correct answer choice, with each of its the sub story points having the definition of ready. And now, what is definition of ready? Again, it's an agile term, so you can go back and study your agile practice guide. Basically, definition of ready is the scope that you are defining in terms of the way you are going to execute the story point from inception to completion. So it means that yes, you are ready with the overall scope of the story point which needs to be executed, and everyone in your team is on the same page in terms of the readiness of that story point to start executing it. Okay, and once it's executed, there is another thing which is called as a definition of done, right? So DOD, probably you have heard of that term. So definition of done is when I will say that the story point is complete, or the story point is sort of done in terms of the execution. So that is definition of done, right? So that's where the term done comes from. So it is a scope validation tool that if you're saying that your story point is complete and it is done, it is not only you who is saying it, but it is all of your team members and your stakeholders are also on the same page in terms of what is a definition of ready and what is definition of done. So homework, guys, please go back and study these terms, such as let's say burn down charts, which we learned in this question. Study this term product backlog, study what is a spike, what is a sprint, what is a retrospective. There are a lot of agile terms that we have considered or we have like discussed in this question. And of course, study what is the definition of ready and what is definition of done. Okay, so the correct answer to this question is option D.
Now, before we move on to question number 4, guys, make sure you do subscribe to my channel PMP with Ray for more such videos like this for your PMP exam preparation, okay? Your support really helps educational channels like this to grow on YouTube. And now, let's move on to question number 4.
Okay, so let's move on to question number 4, guys. So the drill will remain the same. Please read the question and try to answer it before we take this together. So please pause the video here if you want to. Right, so let's get started. A project manager is preparing the charter for an office relocation project. Okay, the project aims to move the company's operations to a new, more cost-effective location. The project sponsor advises the project manager to involve the department heads, okay, who are, let's say, the functional managers, to ensure a smooth transition plan. However, the operations managers who generally report to the department managers. Okay, so you need to understand this basic level of hierarchy, that who is a sponsor, who is a project manager, who is a department head or a functional manager, and who is operations manager. Okay, so for example, the project manager ideally reports to the project sponsor. Okay, operations managers generally report to the department heads. Okay, so that is the general level of hierarchy which you need to understand if you are preparing for your PMP exam. And if you are having a substantial project management experience, or let's say some decent project management experience, you should not have problems in terms of understanding these kind of basic hierarchies. Okay, so let's come back to the question. However, the operations managers are not cooperative, okay, because they believe the relocation will disrupt workflows and reduce team productivity, because they are, let's say, the feet on the floor and they manage the operations day in and day out. Of course, they report to the department heads, and they are not very cooperative with respect to the project charter which you have documented, or which is in the process of documentation, because they believe that the relocation will disrupt the workflows and reduce team productivity. Okay, so which two actions are suitable in this scenario? And again, it's a multi-sided question and you need to select 2 answer choices from the list of 5 answer choices that are provided as part of this question. Okay, so let's look at the answer choices one by one. Option A: schedule a meeting with the operations managers to discuss their concerns and expectations. Okay, probably you want to understand first that what is the concern they are having. So why they are believing that this will disrupt the workflows, reduce team productivity, etc., etc. Because let's say the new location might have the right kind of tools and infrastructure in terms of not disrupting the workflows or improving the productivity, okay, instead of decreasing it. So you need to understand that. So option A might be a correct answer choice. Let's hold it for now. Option B: request the project sponsor to issue a directive mandating the operations manager's support. Of course, this is incorrect, right? This is a pure bureaucracy that it's like your way or the highway, right? You are requesting your project sponsor to issue a directive or a mandate to make the operations managers support you without any question. That is not good project management, right? So option B is definitely incorrect because it is highly bureaucratic and highly, let's say, autocratic as well. Okay, let's look at option C. Present a data-driven evidence showcasing the operational benefits, as I was discussing, that the new location might have better infrastructure, better productivity aids, etc., etc. And of course, the cost savings that the company will be gaining as part of the relocation. Okay, so a data-driven evidence always helps to put some method to the madness and helps the other party who is sitting on the other side of the table understand where you are coming from or what is your rationale or intent with which you are proposing something which you are proposing, right? So option C also looks like a decent answer choice. Let's hold it for now and we might come back to it. Let's look at option D, which is to escalate the issue by highlighting the risk of operational delays due to lack of cooperation. Again, escalation is something which you typically avoid in these kind of questions in your PMP exam or also in the real life scenario as well, because the moment you escalate, your credibility as a project manager goes down. Okay, because escalation means that you are sending that signal to your leadership that this is not getting managed by you and you are not able to manage the situation and it's out of your hands, and you are asking your bosses to manage the situation. Okay, so that is why generally escalation options are incorrect until and unless there is some serious concern, which is, let's say, legal or quality or compliance, etc., or let's say those kind of instances where escalation might make sense. However, here of course escalation is not the first path of choice. Let's look at option E, which is to work with the project sponsor to revise the project charter to address the operations manager's concerns about productivity. Okay, you might say that, look, Ray, I am in the preparation stage of the project charter, so it's a good time now for me to collect inputs and revise the charter if necessary, so that later I do not face any problems whilst I am executing the project. Okay, so option E might also be correct. Now here is the funny bit, you have to select two choices, right? But however, you have landed up with option A, option C, and also option E. Now you have to eliminate one of these three answer choices to arrive at the two answer choices which are correct. Okay. Now if you look very closely at option A and option E, guys, you will see something very interesting. Okay. Now option A is suggesting that you schedule a meeting with operations managers to discuss their concerns and expectations. Okay, which is good. Now option E is suggesting that work with the sponsor, blah blah blah, to revise charter to address the operations managers concerns about productivity. Now you tell me, guys, if you are not having a meeting to discuss the concerns and expectations first, on what basis you will go and update or revise your project charter, right? You can't, because otherwise you will be working only on assumptions. So first you need to do the meeting and then you go and revise the project charter if it is necessary. Now mind it that it might not even be necessary to revise the project charter at all, and their concerns and sort of expectations might be sorted within the meeting itself. So option A is the first path of action which you need to take, and option E is after that, which you can take. However, option C is also very important, which you want to discuss in that meeting, because you want to present a data-driven evidence showcasing operational benefits and cost savings of the relocation, etc., etc. So these are the things you do in a face-to-face or in a Teams Connect. And if after that it is necessary, you may or may not revise the project charter. Okay, because mind it that whenever a project charter gets revised or updated, there is a lot of communication chain you need to do. So for example, you need to communicate to the PMO, you need to communicate to the project sponsor, you need to communicate to the rest of your stakeholders on why are you changing the charter and what is the rationale behind it, etc., etc. Okay, so option E might be a correct answer choice, but it does not supersede the actions which option A and option C is suggesting. And that is why option E falls apart, and the correct answer to this question is option A and option C, which are the two answer choices which you need to select as part of the response to this question. Okay, and option E is a very close answer choice, guys, but it is incorrect, and that is the reason because it is after you do the meeting, after you present a data driven analysis of what you are suggesting and why you are suggesting it, and if it is necessary, you go and revise or update the project charter. You do not go or update a project charter just right off the bat because someone has expressed a concern. Okay, so the correct answer to this question is option A and option C.
I hope you are finding this exercise helpful, right? Remember, the target is to get all the 5 out of the 5 questions correct. However, the minimum expectation is that you should get at least 4 out of the 5 questions correct, right? So here comes the fifth and the final question.
Right, so question number 5, guys, the fifth and the final one, the drill will remain the same. Please read the question and try to solve it before we take this together. You can pause the video here if you want to. Okay, so let's get started. A project involves rollout of a product in 7 different countries, and it is being led by the sponsor in one of the locations, or let's say one of the countries in this scenario. Midway during the project, the project manager is made aware that the quality management team from one of the countries is experiencing heavy workload and they cannot provide their initial level of commitment and involvement. Okay, so what it's happening is a project, it is spanning across 7 different countries. It's being led by a sponsor based out of one of the locations. Okay, now midway during the project, okay, now this phrase means that the project is in execution. Okay, very, very important takeaway. It is not in initiation, not in planning, but in execution. The project manager is made aware that the quality management team from one of the countries is experiencing heavy workload. So this team, which is the quality management team, they are a critical stakeholder, okay, of course, for the project, and they are experiencing some heavy workload. And the initial level of commitment and involvement they showed, that is about to change, probably going downhill from this point. Okay, so how should the project manager address this concern? Okay, so there are four options. Option A: transfer the risk by updating the stakeholder register, transfer the risk by updating the stakeholder engagement plan, mitigate the risk by updating the stakeholder register, mitigate the risk by updating the stakeholder engagement plan. So if I classify these four options, the first two options are talking about transferring the risk, and the next two options are talking about mitigating the risk. Okay, so now clearly it can be safely assumed that in such kind of scenarios, you do not transfer a risk, right? Because what is essentially a risk transfer? A risk transfer is something where you are sometimes not capable of taking the risk both from a monetary standpoint or from an infrastructure standpoint, and that is why you pay someone to take up that risk for you. A typical case in point would be insurance. Okay, let's say a car insurance. So here you are transferring the risk of your car accident to be picked up by an insurance company. So that is a classic example of transferring the risk. However, in this scenario, it is not reasonable to assume that you transfer a risk, or let's say buy out an insurance product, or let's say sort of pay someone to take the ownership of your quality management team from one of your locations not getting involved, right? So that doesn't happen that way. So that's first part of the argument. Now the second part is, and I think this is the more stronger reason of rejecting option A and option B, you do not transfer a risk by updating the stakeholder register. Okay, you do not sort of transfer a risk by updating the stakeholder engagement plan. So it's a wrong artifact being referred to if you are planning to transfer a risk. Okay, so that is why option A and option B both are incorrect. Now that leaves us with option C and option D: mitigate the risk by updating the stakeholder register and mitigate the risk by updating the stakeholder engagement plan. Now, if you go to the basic definitions of a stakeholder engagement plan and stakeholder register, and that can be found in, let's say, page 239 of your process group practice guide, that will essentially give you the answer to this question. Okay, so if you read the stakeholder engagement plan, what is it, right? So it is a component of the project management plan that identifies the strategies and actions required to promote productive involvement of stakeholders in decision making and execution. Okay, and it is very important that the stakeholder engagement plan may include, but of course it's not limited to, specific strategies or approaches for engaging with individual stakeholders or groups of stakeholders. Now, who is your group of stakeholder here? It is your quality management team from one of the locations, right? So that is the artifact you need to refer to, or you need to use in terms of mitigating that risk, and sort of have a risk response strategy that what you are going to do now, because one of your critical stakeholders is not showing the level of involvement which initially was committed. Okay, so that is why option D seems like a more plausible answer choice. Okay, however, let's take a step back and study what stakeholder register consists of. Okay, so the stakeholder register, again, it's a project artifact document. It is prepared in the initiation stage of the project. Okay, and it talks about the identification, assessment, classification of stakeholders, and this document contains information, for example, the identification of the stakeholder, assessment information, stakeholder classification. Okay, whether it is high impact, high influence stakeholder, high impact, high interest stakeholder, etc., etc. Okay, so you do these kind of classifications in your stakeholder register. Now when you initially classified your quality management team as a part of the question, you classified them, let's say, as part of a high impact, high influence stakeholder. Okay, however, now in terms of the engagement, which is your stakeholder engagement plan, in terms of the engagement, it is very, very crucial that you are not getting the right kind of engagement which was initially committed. And that is why you revisit your stakeholder engagement plan and finalize a strategy in terms of how your stakeholder engagement plan will have an action now in terms of getting the right kind of mitigation actions for not having your quality management team getting involved. Now that might be hiring an external consultant, or that might be using some of your internal quality resources from another country, and it can be 1001 options or 1001 sort of actions which you can take. But the guiding document in this scenario will be your stakeholder engagement plan, which can be referred to, and it is very important for you to understand here that it can be referred to in the execution stage of the project, right, midway during the project, because a stakeholder engagement plan is not something that you create in the planning stage and forget about it, right? So that is definitely not the case. You create the plan, get it approved, and when you are in execution, if your engagement strategy from one of your stakeholder changes, you go back to it and sort of take let's say reference from the stakeholder engagement plan to develop any risk mitigation actions. And that is why option C is incorrect, because it is referring to an incorrect document to form a mitigation action. And stakeholder register, as we discussed, for right reasons, will not give you the action item, or let's say the guiding principles of how to drive engagement of a stakeholder. It can give you the initial classification of the stakeholders, but it will not give you the guiding principles of how to keep the stakeholder engaged. Okay, and that is why option C is incorrect, and the correct answer to this question is option D.
So that's the end of the quiz, guys. Let me know in the comment section below how much you were able to score, okay? I'd be very interested to know that. Also, if you have scored less, please do not be demotivated, okay? You just need a bit more preparation. Do a thorough analysis of your mistakes so that you get to know about your knowledge gaps and you are able to fix those on time, okay? Thank you for watching, and I will see you again next month with another session on PMP exam practice questions and answers. Have a nice day and bye for now.